Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today I'll take you to a small island in the English Channel, to a rugged, wind-swept place of rock, sea, and mist, where a lonely man takes upon himself a superhuman task. The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo, published in the year 1866. It is the story of the fisherman Gilliatt, an outsider who, for love, dares the struggle against the mightiest powers of nature. Hugo himself called this work the close of a series about the great powers to which man is delivered up, and here it is the sea. A word beforehand. This story is of a quiet melancholy and ends sadly. Make yourself comfortable, let go of the day, and come along. On the island of Guernsey, one of those small English islands in the English Channel near the coast of France, there lived at the beginning of the 19th century a young man named Gilliatt. He dwelt alone in a remote house at the edge of the sea, a house that people called the bout de la rue, the way's end, far from the villages and the other people. Gilliatt was an outsider, a stranger on the island, for neither he nor his late mother had been born there, and the islanders met him with mistrust. He was a quiet, inward man, strong and skillful, an excellent fisherman and seaman, such as there was no second. He knew the sea, the winds, and the currents like no other. He was master of 1,000 crafts, and with his hands he could accomplish almost anything. And yet, or for that very reason, people held him to be an odd fellow. Some even whispered that he was in league with mysterious powers, for how else, they murmured, could a man wrest so much from the sea? And so Gilliatt lived lonely and withdrawn, without friends, without companions, alone with his work, his boat, and his little garden, which he tended with great love. But in his quiet heart he carried a feeling that filled his whole being. He loved a young girl. Her name was Déruchette, and she was the fairest and most graceful creature on the whole island, a cheerful, lovely being, the adopted daughter of a respected man. For an outsider like Gilliatt, she was unattainable, and he never dared to approach her or to show her his feelings. He revered her only from afar, quietly and hopelessly. The origin of this love, however, lay in a tiny, almost childlike moment. On a winter's day, when the rare snow had fallen on Guernsey, Déruchette had, in high spirits, written a name with her finger in the fresh snow, and this name had been Gilliatt. She had probably done it only out of a fleeting whim, without deeper intent. But Gilliatt, who happened to see it, carried this little sign from then on like a treasure in his heart. And from that hour on, all his thoughts belonged to this girl. On Guernsey there lived a man who was respected and beloved throughout the whole island. Mess Lethierry, an old seaman and shipowner, a good-hearted, energetic man with a passion for the sea. He was Déruchette's foster father and loved her above all else, like the apple of his eye. But besides this girl, there was a second thing that filled his heart, and that was a ship. Lethierry owned the first and only steamship of the island, the Durande. At a time when most people met the new smoking monster with mistrust and held the old sailing ships to be more honest, Lethierry had boldly staked his faith on progress. The Durande sailed regularly back and forth between Guernsey and the French coast, carried goods and travelers, and she was the pride of her owner and the foundation of his prosperity. Lethierry loved this ship with an almost fatherly tenderness, for it embodied for him the victory of the human inventive spirit over the old prejudices, the triumph of the machine that moved by its own power, independent of the mercy of the wind. The precious engine within the Durande was for him the very heart, the wondrous work on which he founded all his pride. Had anyone once come to him with the news that the ship was lost, it would have struck him like the loss of a child. But in his service there stood men who were not quite to be trusted. There was above all the captain of the Durande, a certain Clubin, a man who gave himself the appearance of the greatest honesty and piety. Throughout the whole land, Clubin passed for a model of uprightness, for a man on whose word one could build houses, and this very reputation of flawless integrity was his greatest capital. Yet behind this mask there hid a cold, calculating villain, who had long lain secretly in wait for an opportunity to enrich himself at a single stroke and then to disappear without a trace. He had patiently built up his reputation for honesty over years, solely for the purpose of using it one day for a single great fraud, in which no one would suspect him, and the opportunity for it was soon to present itself. The opportunity. Clubin had waited for so long came his way one day. On a voyage, he came into possession of a considerable sum of money that belonged to Lethierry, and he formed a devilish plan to seize this money for himself, and at the same time to feign his own death, so that no one would ever pursue him. His scheme was aimed at what was dearest to Lethierry, at the Durande herself. Clubin intended to run the ship aground deliberately, and indeed onto a certain reef near the French coast that he knew exactly. From there, so his calculation ran, he would swim effortlessly to the nearby land, while all believed him drowned, and disappear forever with the money. On a day when a thick fog lay over the sea, he set his plan in motion. He steered the Durande deliberately off her right course in order to drive her onto that reef near the coast. But the fog he meant to turn to his advantage became his undoing. For in the impenetrable wall of gray, Clubin himself miscalculated and lost his bearings. Instead of onto the reef near the coast that he had steered for, the Durande drifted astray and ran onto the notorious Douvres rocks, two high, lonely cliffs far out in the open sea, distant from all coast and all help, at one of the most feared and inaccessible places of the whole sea. The ship stuck fast, wedged between the two rock towers, badly damaged, yet the precious engine in the hull remained unharmed. Clubin now played the dutiful captain who does not abandon his ship, and sent the crew off in a boat in order to remain behind alone, as he had planned. He still believed himself near the coast, and meant, as soon as the others were gone, to swim ashore with the money. But when the fog lifted, he recognized the truth with horror. All around him lay only the open, endless sea, miles from any land. His own treachery had let him walk into the trap, and at this lonely, deadly place, Clubin, in the end, found death himself in the waters. But the news of the wreck of the Durande reached Guernsey and struck Mess Lethierry like a blow from a club. The news of the loss of the Durande plunged Mess Lethierry into the deepest despair. At a single stroke there was taken from him what had been his life's work and his whole pride. He sat there, broken, a suddenly aged man, for with the ship everything seemed lost to him: his fortune, his future, his faith in himself. But then it got about that the ship was indeed destroyed, yet the precious engine in the hull hung unharmed between the Douvres rocks. And in Lethierry there sprouted a tiny, desperate spark of hope. If only it could be managed to salvage this engine, then a new ship could be built around it, and not all was yet lost. But everyone on the island knew that this was impossible. The Douvres rocks lay far out in the open sea, at a place the sailors avoided like death. To sail out there alone, to settle in among the cliffs, to loosen the heavy engine from the wreck with bare hands and carry it back over the sea, that seemed a task no single man could ever accomplish. In his despair, Lethierry spoke before all a word that was more a cry of hopelessness than a promise seriously meant. He declared that whoever should salvage the engine of the Durande and bring it back to Guernsey should have his foster daughter Déruchette for his wife. For Gilliatt, who happened to be present, his whole life was transformed in that moment. Here was the opportunity, the only one that would ever offer itself to him, to win the girl whom he loved in silence and hopelessly. Without making many words, he formed his resolve. That very same day he fitted out his little boat with tools and the barest necessities, as well as he could, and without telling anyone what he intended, he put to sea alone and set course for the distant, dreaded Douvres rocks, resolved to dare the impossible or to perish in the attempt. After a long, lonely voyage over the open sea, Gilliatt at last reached the Douvres rocks. Before him, the two high cliffs rose from the water, and between them, wedged high up among the rock towers, hung the wreck of the Durande, broken, yet with the unharmed engine in its hull. The sight was at once shattering and heartening, for now Gilliatt saw with his own eyes that the engine really was still there, and at the same time he grasped the whole extent of what he had undertaken. He settled himself on the bare rock as well as he could. He found a narrow niche in the stone that served him as shelter and made ready his boat and his tools. From now on, there began for him a life of unimaginable hardship. All alone, without help, without a soul far and wide, in the midst of the raging sea, he set about the well-nigh impossible work. His plan was as bold as it was simple. He wished to loosen the heavy engine from the breaking wreck without damaging it, bring it down into his little boat, and carry it back over the sea to Guernsey. But between this plan and its execution lay weeks of toil. Gilliatt had to create for himself everything he needed, from the little that stood at his disposal, from driftwood, from parts of the wreck, from what the sea carried to him. He built himself tools, pulleys, and lifting gear. He cut, hammered, sawed, and forged. He devised ingenious constructions to be able to raise and hold the engine that weighed tons. He worked from the first morning light into the night, without rest, driven by the one thought of Déruchette. Hunger tormented him, for his provisions were scant, and he had to nourish himself from what he found in the sea and on the rocks, from shellfish, from rainwater, from the little that the barren surroundings yielded. The loneliness weighed on him, and the heavy physical labor gnawed at his strength. But Gilliatt did not give up. Day after day he wrested a small piece of progress from the rock and the wreck, and slowly, infinitely slowly, his daring work took shape. The weeks on the Douvres rocks became for Gilliatt a trial such as hardly any man is able to endure. The sea that surrounded him was no quiet ally but a relentless adversary. Again and again winds and waves lashed against the rocks, and once a mighty storm broke over him that threatened at a single stroke to destroy his whole laboriously built work. For days the tempest raged, and Gilliatt fought with the strength of desperation to protect his constructions, his boat, and the half-salvaged engine. In feverish haste he built a wall of rock and wreckage, a rampart against the onrushing waves, and by sheer force of will and skill he managed to wrest from the storm the prey it had already believed its own. When the tempest at last subsided, Gilliatt was exhausted to the limit of his strength, worn out, battered, yet his work still stood, and he carried his labor on. At last, after endless toil, the time had come. With the self-built pulleys and levers, he achieved the incredible. He loosened the heavy engine from the wreck, lifted it slowly and carefully out, and let it down safely into his waiting boat. What had seemed impossible to the whole island, this one man had accomplished through intellect, endurance, and superhuman effort. But the sea was not yet ready to let him go. For when Gilead climbed down into a hollow of the rocks to refresh himself, he fell into the power of a creature of the deep that dwelt at this lonely place. A monster of the sea, a giant octopus with long, greedy tentacles, shot out from a cleft in the rock and enfolded him, drew him to itself with uncanny strength in order to pull him into the depths and devour him. Gilead, seized and clasped by the tough arms of the beast, struggled for his life. The struggle between the man and the monster was terrible. The tough arms of the beast held Gilead enfolded and sought to drag him into the depths, but Gilead kept his presence of mind. He knew that brute force would avail nothing against the strength of these many arms, and so he bethought himself of the one vulnerable spot of the creature. With a quick, resolute movement, he set his knife where it struck the beast fatally, and with a last struggle he freed himself from the clasp. Exhausted but alive, he escaped the creature of the deep and drew back onto the safe rock. Now the last obstacle was overcome. Gilead had salvaged the engine, weathered the storm, and even defied the monster of the sea. He made his boat ready for the return voyage, the precious engine well secured, and set out on the journey home to Guernsey, worn out and brought to the edge of his strength, yet filled with a quiet triumph. When at last, emaciated and marked by the weeks of privation, he sailed once more into the harbor of Guernsey and brought with him the salvaged engine of the Durande, at first, people could scarcely believe what they saw. The news spread like wildfire over the whole island, and the people streamed together to see the man who had accomplished the impossible. Mess Lethierry, who had lost all his courage for life, could scarcely grasp his fortune when the unharmed engine was brought to him. His ship, his life's work, his future, everything seemed given back to him at a single stroke. In his overflowing gratitude and joy, he embraced Gilead, called him his savior, his son, and was firmly resolved to keep his word. Gilead was to receive Déruchette for his wife, and the wedding was to be celebrated without delay the very next day. For Gilead, it now seemed at last, after all the toil and loneliness, that the reward of his superhuman struggle was within reach, and the dream of his life stood before its fulfillment. But the happiness that stood so near before Gilead's eyes was to withdraw from him at the last moment. For as he, quiet and full of soft hope, looked toward the day of his wedding, he made a discovery that changed everything. Déruchette, the girl for whom he had taken all this upon himself, loved another. Her heart belonged to a young clergyman of the island, a man named Ebenezer, and the two had long, in all quietness, been devoted to each other in love. Déruchette knew nothing of Gilead's feelings, and did not suspect that it was he who had accomplished the impossible for her sake. She awaited the marriage to the quiet, strange fisherman only with dread and resignation, because her foster father had so promised it, while her heart belonged after all to the young clergyman. Gilead recognized the truth when he saw the two together unobserved, and in that moment he grasped that his hard-won happiness was an empty one. He could have insisted on his right. Lethierry's word and the gratitude of the whole island stood on his side, and no one would have denied him Déruchette's hand. But Gilead was not the man to force a happiness that was founded on the unhappiness of his beloved. He loved Déruchette too much to bind her to himself when her heart belonged to another. And so he formed the last greatest resolve of his life, a resolve of pure selflessness. He stepped to the side of the two lovers, helped them to their happiness, arranged everything, and made it possible for Déruchette and the young clergyman to be secretly married that very same day and to leave the island together in order to begin a new life elsewhere. With that, he gave up freely and without complaint all that for which he had suffered and fought. When the ship that carried the two away at last cast off and sailed out onto the open sea, Gilliatt remained behind, alone. He went down to the coast, to a place in the rock by the sea that he knew, and sat down there, his face turned toward the water and the departing ship. The tide began to rise, as it did at this place, slowly and steadily. But Gilliatt remained seated, and gazed unwaveringly after the distant ship that carried the woman he loved away into her happiness. And while the water rose and the sail grew smaller on the horizon, he remained motionless, his gaze on the vanishing ship, until the sea enfolded him, and the sea, from which he had wrested so much, took him at the last forever to itself. That was our short retelling of The Toilers of the Sea by Victor Hugo, a story of lonely greatness, of a superhuman struggle against the powers of nature, and of a love that forgot itself. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.